Friends, over the last number of weeks, I have reflected on 3 chapters of a book by Bishop Michael Curry entitled Love is the Way. And there's a lot more to be explored in the book with lots of rich personal insights. But today, I think I would probably be the last reflection on that book. I'd like to share a few of his thoughts today under the questions. Firstly, can love really make a difference in this world? And also the question, how do we keep ourselves focused on the way of love in a troubled and divided world? Bishop Michael Curry writes that on one occasion he was speaking about how he believed that love could change the world. And he was questioned by a journalist who asked him, well, that sounds nice, but isn't a world built on love a utopian dream? This had echoed a similar question from a different journalist. Can this really work? In other words, is love really an effective tool to change the world? But for a moment, Bishop Curry had to stop and ask himself, could it be, in fact, that getting angry, domineering, and violent is, in fact, more productive than doubling down on love? But after a moment of pause, Michael Curry replied with a question of his own. How is the way of the world working for you right now? He went on to say that the world that we're living in right now is a world built on selfishness, indifference, and even hatred. And I think most of us could agree, it doesn't look good. Amongst a host of other major issues of concern, we have wars and rumors of wars, and we have an earth exploited to a point of crisis, despite the fact that, to quote a protest sign, mass extinction is bad for profit. Michael Curry goes on that what this all adds up to is mutually assured destruction, which he suggests is an insanity. And suddenly, a world built on love, he says, starts to look like the sane one. And so he believes that not only will love work, but that it's the only thing that in the end will work. He goes on to say that love builds, hate destroys. He says we have to stop the madness. And you don't stop the madness with more madness. He says that love is God's way, the moral way. But it's also the only thing that ultimately works. He says it's the rare moment where idealism actually overlaps with pragmatism. And he suggests that people don't often think of Jesus as a strategist. But Michael Curry describes Jesus as a leader who successfully built what was essentially a radical equal rights movement within a brutal Roman Empire, a movement that has continued for 2,000 years. And he suggests that if you do that, you can't do that without being a master strategist. And so when Jesus said, "Love those who curse you," what Michael Curry calls Jesus' famous call to nonviolence, he wasn't just speaking of the kind of behavior that he believed God preferred. He was offering a strategy, a how-to guide on changing negative situations into positive ones. And Michael Curry notes that when Jesus spoke these words in the Sermon on the Mount, he was in fact delivering them to an oppressed and an occupied people, sharecroppers, seething with anger and sometimes rebelling against their Roman oppressors. The Apostle Paul is sometimes held in contrast to Jesus. It's often suggested that Jesus invited ordinary people into a new way of life, while Paul, on the other hand, is said to have created a religion around Jesus. But Michael Curry reminds us that in Paul's letter to the Romans in chapter 12, he does in fact capture the very spirit of Jesus' teachings from the Sermon on the Mount. where Paul encourages the Christians living in Rome to follow the way of love. Not as a call to give up or to give in to injustice, but as a way to help and heal, to lift up and to liberate. As Michael Curry puts it, to defang and disarm an empire without in the process hurting or harming. We read those words in last week's service. Do not be overcome by evil, but rather overcome evil with good. And that's exactly what Jesus was teaching. Michael Curry writes that it is what Gandhi, inspired by Jesus, would later call pricking the conscience, disarming one's oppressors with behavior so loving that they can't help feeling the wrongness of their own hate, and thus opening their minds to new possibilities. Michael Curry believes that in the end, love is the only thing that really works. And although the Jesus movement, otherwise known as the church, has not always practiced this very consistently, when it has practiced the Christ-like way of love, it has been like a softening agent in society, transforming society for the better. Jesus called it being salt and light. He also referred to it as being like yeast or leaven in society. It only takes a little bit of yeast to affect the whole dough and to make it all rise. One of Michael Curry's early heroes was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Although he freely admits that Martin Luther King was by no means a perfect person, like all of us, he too was both saint and sinner. But one thing that Martin Luther King Jr. did get right was to paint a picture of a dream, of a different kind of a world, not based on racism and segregation, and that the methods by which he sought to achieve that dream were the ways of non-violent action that he had learned in the scriptures from Jesus. Michael Curry writes how the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. was an enormous blow, not just to himself, Michael Curry, but also to others who had put their hope in him. For some, it raised the question of whether the way of love really can change the world. For others, it was a reminder that following the way of Jesus in the world is not always easy and can indeed bring reaction and consequences, as it did for Jesus. Jesus warns of this, but it didn't stop him from giving his own life for the cause of love. And in doing so, he encourages his followers to not give up on the way of love either, for it will not be without reward. Martin Luther King himself knew how difficult it is to consistently follow the way of love in the face of opposition and violence. And so to encourage those who were part of his own movement, he laid out for them what he called the 10 commandments of non-violence. Michael Curry says that commandment number 10 was very specific to marching, and so doesn't bear worth reflecting on here. But numbers 1 to 9 are more universal in nature. I personally was unaware of these so-called 10 commandments of non-violence of Martin Luther King until I read them in Michael Curry's book. And I have to say, not only was I surprised by them, but in fact also deeply impressed by them. I can't go into detail on all of them, but I will try to outline them very briefly. Commandment 1, meditate daily on the teachings and the life of Jesus. Commandment 2, remember always that the non-violent movement seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. Commandment 3, walk and talk in the manner of love, for God is love. This, says Michael Curry, is the call to be the change that you would like to see in the world. Make the dream real by enacting it. Commandment 4. Pray daily to be used by God in order that all people might be free. This is about having a vision of love and peace that goes beyond and is bigger than one's own group, thinking beyond, that all people might be free. Commandment 5. Sacrifice personal wishes in order that all people might be free. Michael Curry invites us to recall that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's selfishness. Sacrifice personal wishes in order that all people might be free. Commandment 6. Observe with both friend and foe the ordinary rules of courtesy. Commandment 7. Seek to perform regular service for others and for the world. And Michael Curry writes that service is the way that we can exercise the muscles of love. Commandment 8. Refrain from the violence of fist, tongue, or heart. Now, I'm guessing that most of us are generally able to restrain ourselves when it comes to the violence of fist. How do we fare when it comes to the violence of tongue or heart? Commandment 9. Strive to be in good spiritual and bodily health. And Michael Curry writes that this is the call to put on our own oxygen mask first. Unselfish living, he says, doesn't mean ignoring the self or becoming anybody's doormat. So, can love make a difference? Can love change the world? On one occasion, Michael Curry was preaching at the Howard University's Rankin College or Rankin Chapel in Washington, D.C. And afterwards, he was informed that the famous South African jazz trumpeter Hugh Masekela wished to meet him. Michael Curry was a bit dumbfounded. He had no idea why one of the world's great jazz trumpeters would want to meet him. Hugh Masekela was waiting in the vestry as Michael Curry came in, the jazz trumpeter threw out his hand and started shaking Bishop Curry's hand vigorously, saying, "Anytime I come across an Anglican bishop, I make sure to meet him." Hugh Masekela went on to explain that it was the Anglican Archbishop Trevor Huddleston who had made it possible for him to become who he was. When Hugh was just a teenager, he saw a movie based on a famous jazz trumpeter, which really captured his imagination. And the next day, he went to the chaplain of his school, who was Father Trevor Huddleston, an Anglican monk and priest from Murfield in West Yorkshire, who had chosen to serve the poor community of Sophiatown in Johannesburg. Hugh Masekela told Father Huddleston of his dream that he wanted to play the trumpet. And seeing the light in that teenager's eyes, Trevor Huddleston went to a local music shop and bought him a trumpet. Handing the trumpet over to Hugh Masekela, Trevor Huddleston had no idea of what an impact that would have on Hugh, or how Hugh would become a world-renowned jazz trumpeter. As Michael Curry writes, all he knew was that he had seen love glimmering in the eyes of Hugh, and he did what he could to add heat to its light. Trevor Huddleston's gift of the trumpet was a gift of love that changed a young black teenager's life growing up in apartheid South Africa. Hugh Masekela is not the only one to have been impacted in a profound way by Father Trevor Huddleston. Archbishop Desmond Tutu told a very similar story, how when he was a young boy, he had contracted polio at a time when there was still no vaccine, and he ended up in hospital where he stayed for months. Father Trevor Huddleston would come and visit him in hospital and bring him books to make sure that he didn't fall behind in his schoolwork. It was the love and the care shown by Father Trevor Huddleston that inspired a young Desmond Tutu later in his life to become an Anglican priest, which later led him to become first Bishop of Johannesburg and later Archbishop of Cape Town, playing an enormous role in advocating for the end of apartheid in South Africa and giving the people of South Africa the dream of the Rainbow Nation as a vision for a new South Africa for everyone to aspire to. Anyone who knows something about South Africa would have to concede that that dream of a new South Africa has not been fully realized. In some ways, it's limping along at the moment. Corruption has indeed eaten away at some of that dream. But at the time, it still needs to be acknowledged that Archbishop Desmond Tutu played a key role in preventing South Africa from descending into civil war. Can love make a difference in this world? Trevor Huddleston's acts of love and kindness to Hugh Masekela and Desmond Tutu made an enormous difference, and particularly in the case of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, had positive consequences that go far beyond any ability to have planned or predicted. I'm reminded of the story of the starfish by Lauren Isley. It all started when a young girl was walking along a beach upon which thousands of starfish had been washed up during a terrible storm. When she came to each starfish, she would pick it up and throw it back into the ocean. And people watched her with amusement. She had been doing this for some time when a man approached her and said, "Little girl, why are you doing this? Look at the beach. You can't save all of these starfish. You can't begin to make a difference." The girl seemed crushed at first, suddenly deflated. But after a few moments, she bent back down, picked up another starfish, and hurled it as far as she could into the ocean. Then she looked up at the man and replied, "Well, I made a difference for that one." The old man looked at the little girl inquisitively and thought about what she had done and said, and inspired, he joined the little girl in throwing starfish back into the sea. Michael Curry asks, what kind of a world would we live in if even half the people were committed to living in the way of love? What if it was even just 25% of people? What kind of difference could we make together? God bless as you think and ponder on these things. Amen.